This video introduces the UK Parliament, nicknamed the Mother of all Parliaments. It has a rich and long history, and I'll give you a very short version of that now. We first see a meeting of the United Kingdom Parliament after 1707, when the Act of Union was signed, formally joining the nations of England and Scotland in a wider union. Irish MPs would join them in 1801. But the idea of a parliament consisting of commoners and lords goes back to the 13th century and 1265, when Simon de Montfort, after overthrowing the king, for the first time invited commoners as well as a noble gentleman to advise the ruler of the day. The very concept of a parliament in itself goes back to the Anglo-Saxon period in the 8th century, where the king would have a witan, a small group of powerful individuals, again advising and lobbying the king for change. Because of Parliament's long and storied history, there are some rather strange traditions that exist today. For example, in the House of Commons, the government and the opposition are sat roughly 4 metres apart, which is said to be just longer than 2 swords' lengths to discourage them from taking up arms against one another. You'll also see on the House of Commons floor a line which individuals cannot cross during debates. When votes are counted, MPs are physically counted. They walk into the aye and no lobbies and they are manually counted. Now, in this day and age, we see MPs during Prime Minister's questions on their phones, on their iPads, live tweeting from Prime Minister's questions. But still, in this day and age, in the 21st century, that is the system of counting votes in the House of Commons, quite literally a head count. That is why voting with the other side, so to speak, is referred to as crossing the floor, because an MP literally has to cross the floor of the House of Commons to vote either with the opposition or with the government. Finally, another tradition that exists is that the Speaker starts each day of parliamentary business with a formal procession preceded by a gold mace entering the Commons. He's accompanied by Parliament's chaplain, and prayers are held before every parliamentary sitting. MPs can choose to attend if they wish. All they have to do is place their prayer cards in the seat that they intend to sit in. And cynically, in the modern age, MPs do this in order to reserve the best seats, particularly for Prime Minister's questions. The House of Commons simply isn't big enough for 650 individuals. It can get quite cramped in there. The House of Lords is not big enough for 800 peers, as there currently are. And in that case, Parliament is not fit for holding all of the members of both houses. Attendance in the Lords is quite poor, which means that it's quite uncommon to see the House of Lords cramped, like we can see the House of Commons during important debates. Before we move on, a few key words to define. I'm going to refer to Parliament as a legislature, ending URE. The term legislature simply meaning another word for Parliament. It is the body, the sort of the physical building that we refer to when we're talking about Parliament. When we're talking about Parliament as an institution, as a thing, we refer to it as the legislature, the place where laws are debated. Those laws, when they are passed, become known as legislation, the word ending I-O-N. So any reference to legislation is the laws themselves after they've been passed. And then finally, you may hear the term legislative, which refers to the process, the legislative process, the process of producing, debating, voting on legislation. Finally, another key word is the word bicameral. Bi meaning two. Bicameral means that Parliament is made up of 2 chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And much like our school, the girls' division and the boys' division, the House of Commons and the House of Lords are essentially a mirror image of one another. And you can see that if we look at the picture there of the structure of Parliament. Parliament is a mirror image. The Commons and the Lords are the same size. And actually on the Westminster trip, what surprises pupils is how small those rooms are in the Palace of Westminster. Such a great, grand building. The thing that shocks students is how small those rooms are. So there we go. Some key terms for you to remember. As I said on the previous slide, Parliament is a bicameral legislature. So there are two chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And one thing that you will see is that Parliament is colour-coded. The colour of the Commons is green, the colour of the Lords is red. So there you can see a view of, first of all, the Commons and the Lords as well. One thing that you will notice that is different is that there is room for the monarch in the House of Lords, and there is a throne upon which the monarch sits whenever the monarch enters Parliament. And though a ceremonial role today, the monarch plays a crucial role in Parliament and actually makes up the third element of Parliament. No bill becomes law without the Queen's say-so. Queen Elizabeth II has to grant royal assent to every law that is agreed and passed by the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Now, it would be quite the crisis if the Queen decided to vote against legislation. The monarch and the royal family today are seen as non-political and impartial. They're not seen to be meddling in British politics, and royal assent has been granted to Acts of Parliament for well over 300 years. So let's talk about the Commons. The Commons is made up of 650 MPs that, in theory, are elected every 5 years. But there is an Act of Parliament, the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which does outline a means for which an early election can be held. If a vote in the House of Commons deems that it is time for an early election, then a campaign takes place. But at the very least, our MPs are elected every 5 years. There are more members of the House of Lords than there are the House of Commons. There are roughly 800 members of the House of Lords. And that might surprise anyone who's watched a debate in the Lords, because quite often there's sort of room to spare when debates are taking place. The reason why attendance is lower in the Lords is a lot of the members of the House of Lords are what we call life peers. And they are granted those peerages for services to the country in many different areas. It may be sport, it may be charitable efforts, it could be education. And so quite often members of the House of Lords attend only debates that they feel they can lend their expertise to. 92 members of the House of Lords are hereditary peers. And traditionally, before 1999, these titles were passed down from father to eldest child, invariably the son, in, again, one of those centuries-old traditions which many hundreds of years ago would have seemed an obvious and proper thing to do. But by the turn of the 21st century, the idea of having hereditary peers seemed outdated. So the Labour government of the time decided it was time to get rid of them, and all but 92 were removed. What happens today with a hereditary peer is when one dies, they actually vote the newest member to the 92. So there's an irony there that in this undemocratic element of Parliament, where titles are sort of passed down based on somebody's family lineage, that there is an element of democracy within that, because they vote their next member into that group of 92. There are also 26 bishops from the Church of England in the House of Lords, and generally they are the most senior bishops in the Church of England, but not necessarily. It's not a written rule, but the 5 largest dioceses in the Church of England have their bishop in it. The Archbishop of Canterbury, we've also got Durham, London, Winchester and York. You can see there the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, in the House of Lords. Now, there are 2 key terms to get your head around. Life and hereditary peers combined are referred to as the Lords Temporal, whereas the 26 bishops from the Church of England are referred to as the Lords Spiritual. It's actually quite common for a country to have a bicameral legislature. Most countries will have a legislative process where two chambers consider it. The US, for example, has the House of Representatives and the Senate. In Germany, they have the Bundestag and the Bundesrat. So it's quite common for a country to have two chambers where legislation is considered, debated, and either passed or defeated. But what is uncommon in the case of the United Kingdom is that almost all power is vested in one of those two chambers. The 1911 and 1949 Parliament Acts have ensured that Parliament dominates the legislative process compared with the House of Lords. Today, the House of Lords is essentially an advisory body. It can send legislation back in order to make the Commons or the government of the day think again and rethink or amend legislation, but it doesn't hold the power that it used to, where it would be able to block legislation from being passed. One interesting situation in the United Kingdom is that we have a fusion of powers. The Prime Minister and the wider executive, the Cabinet, sit in Parliament. And in the vast majority of cases, the Prime Minister has to be, but most members of Cabinet are members of the House of Commons. And that is, again, different to other countries. In the United States, we quite often see experts in certain fields brought in to the executive. And they can quite often be people with no political experience whatsoever, being given a government department to run. In the United Kingdom, it comes from our politicians. Now, there are rare examples where a member of the House of Lords will be a member of Cabinet, but by and large, it's overwhelmingly dominated by members of the House of Commons. The Prime Minister must be a member of the Commons. The last time this wasn't the case was in 1963, when Alec Douglas-Home was the Conservative Party leader, and as the Conservatives were the largest party in the House of Commons, he was therefore Prime Minister. But there was a problem. He was a member of the House of Lords. And what he had to do is resign his peerage, give up his peerage, and stand in a by-election and become a member of the Commons in order to serve as Prime Minister. The layout of the Commons is very adversarial. You've got two sides facing one another, the government side and the opposition to the left of the Speaker. I'll talk about the Speaker in a little bit later on. The vast majority of MPs do belong to a party. There are a small number of independent MPs. However, quite often those that are independent have had their status as an MP for the party removed. An example might be Tobias Ellwood in 2022. The Conservative Party removed the Conservative whip. He was no longer a Conservative MP, and that was because he missed the government vote of confidence, because he was late returning from a trip visiting the President of Moldova. After reports into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party suspended Jeremy Corbyn, member for Islington North. And so in the early reign of Sir Keir Starmer as leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn sat in Parliament as an independent, not a Labour MP. So quite often our independent MPs are they have their status within the party taken away from them as a form of party discipline. The last MP to be elected as an independent was Lady Herman in North Down in Northern Ireland, but even then, Lady Herman was a former Conservative. As I said before, there are 650 MPs, and they roughly represent an average constituency size of 68,000 people. and so all MPs can generally claim to be representing a similar portion of the British electorate. It does get a little bit difficult when it gets to the islands of the United Kingdom. So the Isle of Wight is the largest constituency because there are 113,000 people living there. And then as we get out to the Shetland Islands or the Hebrides, we see much smaller constituencies as a result of those small island populations. In the House of Lords, there are members belonging to political parties because they're quite often political appointments. Prime Ministers have the right to appoint members to the House of Lords, and therefore the membership of the Lords fluctuates. So it was roughly around 800 people in 2021, and because life peers, their peerage ends when they die, it's quite often that the membership of the Lords can fluctuate. The Lords is unelected and therefore has no democratic mandate, and that is why the legislative process means that the Commons dominates, because the Commons can be said to represent the people of the United Kingdom, whereas the Lords cannot do that because they are appointed rather than elected. There are also a large number of individuals. You can see on the layout of the Lords, as well as the throne, we've got the woolsack, but there's also what we call cross benches, which means that there are members of the Lords who don't have any party affiliation whatsoever. They are referred to as cross benchers because they don't sit on the government or opposition side. They sit on the floor of the House of Lords. So a quick recap then on our introduction to the UK Parliament. The very concept of advisors to the ruler of the day is an Anglo-Saxon concept dating back to the 8th century and the Witan. We get the bicameral nature of Parliament from Simon de Montfort in the 13th century, when we see commoners advising the ruler of the day for the very first time. We get this concept of Parliament being for all of a united kingdom in the 18th century with the Act of Union with Scotland. So rather than being an English Parliament, we get Scottish voices from the 18th century. And then in the 19th century, Irish MPs are elected too. As I said, it's not uncommon to have a bicameral legislature. It's not uncommon to see a country that has two houses or two chambers where legislation is discussed. But what is unique about the United Kingdom is it's the lower house, the House of Commons, that has the majority influence when it comes to passing legislation. The House of Lords can delay and frustrate legislation, but they can't block it like they were able to centuries ago. I also said that there is a third element to Parliament alongside the Commons and the Lords, and that of course is the monarch. No bill becomes law without royal assent, without the assent of the monarch, which is signing that bill into law. And as I said, we have to go way back to the 18th century to find the last time that a monarch did not give that assent. So it is a convention, an accepted rule of the game, that the monarch grants assent to every bill, that it would be undemocratic for the monarch as one person to decide if a law should or should not be passed. And so the Queen signs every bill into law, regardless of her personal views on it. In the Commons, there are 650 MPs elected at most once every 5 years. There are roughly 800 members of the House of Lords. They can be split up into the Lords Temporal, which is life peers and hereditary peers, and the Lords Spiritual, which is the small number 26 bishops of the Church of England. Although the vast majority of MPs belong to a political party, and those that don't are more often than not removed from the party as a form of punishment, we do see a small number of so-called crossbenchers in the House of Lords, members that don't belong to a political party, whether it be the government or opposition. And finally, the monarch's role is seen as one that is separate and above party politics. And so royal assent is granted. The monarch does not consider it appropriate to make their political statement in the form of not granting royal assent, but also the Queen's speech, which is given to Parliament at the open of every parliamentary session, is actually written by the government. And the Queen, in her speech to Parliament, is essentially outlining the government's agenda. That letter is written by the government for the monarch to read. So there you have it, a brief introduction to the UK Parliament. You may have been making notes as you go along. You may have just sat there and listened to it and tried to take it in. The beautiful thing about these videos is you can always go back and watch it again. So if it comes to revision, or you want to go back and listen to it a second time and make notes as you go, then I would recommend doing so.